The dominant primordial beast was strong in Buck, and under the fierce conditions of trail life, it grew and grew. Yet it was a secret growth. His newborn cunning gave him poise and control. He was too busy adjusting himself to the new life to feel at ease, and not only did he not pick fights, but he avoided them whenever possible. A certain deliberateness characterized his attitude. He wasn't prone to rashness and precipitate action. In the bitter hatred between him and Spitz, he betrayed no impatience and shunned all offensive acts. On the other hand, possibly because he divined in Buck a dangerous rival, Spitz never lost an opportunity of showing his teeth. He even went out of his way to bully Buck, striving constantly to start the fight, which could only end in the death of one or the other. Early in the trip, this might have taken place had it not been for an unwanted accident. At the end of the day, a bleak and miserable camp on the shore of Lake Labarge, driving snow, a wind that cut like a white-hot knife, and darkness had forced them to grope for a camping place. They could hardly have fared worse. At their backs rose a perpendicular wall of rock, and Perrault and Francois were compelled to make their fire and spread their sleeping robes on ice of the lake itself. The tent they discarded at Daya in order to travel light. A few sticks of driftwood furnished them with a fire that thawed down through the ice and left them to eat supper in the dark. Close in on a sheltering rock, Buck made his nest. So snug and warm was it that he was loath to leave it when Francois distributed the fish that first thawed over the fire. But when Buck finished his ration and returned, he found his nest occupied. A warning snarl told him the trespasser was Spitz. Till now, Buck had avoided trouble with his enemy, but this was too much. The beast in him roared. He sprang upon Spitz with a fury which surprised them both, and Spitz particularly, for his whole experience with Buck had gone to teach him that his rival was an unusually timid dog who managed to hold his own only because of his great weight and size. Francois was surprised, too, when they shot out in a tangle from the disrupted nest, and he divined the cause of the trouble. "Ah!" he cried to Buck. "Give it to him, by gar! Give it to him, the dirty thief!" Spitz was equally willing. He was crying with sheer rage and eagerness as they circled back and forth for a chance to spring in. Buck was no less eager and no less cautious, as he likewise circled back and forth for the advantage. But it was then the unexpected happened, the thing which projected their struggle for supremacy far into the future, past many a weary mile of trail and toil. An oath from Perrault, the resounding impact of a club upon a bony frame, and a shrill yelp of pain heralded the breaking forth of pandemonium. The camp was suddenly discovered to be alive with skulking furry forms, starving huskies, 4 or 5 score of them, who scented the camp from some Indian village. They had crept in while Buck and Spitz were fighting, and when the 2 men sprang among them with stout clubs, they showed their teeth and fought back. They were crazed by the smell of food. Perrault found one with head buried in the grub box. His club landed heavily on the gaunt ribs, and the grub box was capsized on the ground. On the instant, a score of famished brutes were scrambling for the bread and bacon. The clubs fell upon them unheeded. They yelped and howled under the rain of blows, but struggled none the less madly till the last crumb had been devoured. In the meantime, the astonished team dogs had burst out of their nests, only to be set upon by their fierce invaders. Never had Buck seen such dogs. It seemed as though their bones would burst through their skins. They were mere skeletons, draped loosely in dragged hides, with blazing eyes and slavered fangs. But the hunger madness made them terrifying, irresistible. There was no opposing them. The team dogs slept back against the cliff at the first onset. Buck was beset by 3 huskies, and in a thrice his head and shoulders were ripped and slashed. The din was frightful. Billy was crying as usual. Dave and Solix, dripping blood from a score of wounds, were fighting bravely, side by side. Joe was snapping like a demon. Once his teeth closed on the foreleg of a husky, and he crunched down through the bone. Pike, the malingerer, leaped upon the crippled animal, breaking its neck with a quick flash of teeth and a jerk. Buck got a frothing adversary by the throat, and sprayed with blood when his tank sank through the jugular. The warm taste of it in his mouth goaded him to greater fierceness. He flung himself upon another, and at the same time felt teeth sinking into his own throat. It was Spitz, treacherously attacking him from the side. Perrault and Francois, having cleaned out their part of the camp, hurried to save their sled dogs. The wild wave of famished beasts rolled back before them, and Buck shook himself free. It was only for a moment. The two men were compelled to run back to save the grub, upon which the huskies returned to attack on the team. Billy, terrified into bravery, sprang through the savage circle and fled away over the ice. Pike and Dub followed on the heels with the rest of the team behind. As Buck drew himself to spring after them, out of the tail of his eye he saw Spitz rush upon him with the evident intention of overthrowing him. Once off his feet and under the mask of huskies, there was no hope for him, but he braced himself to the shock of Spitz's charge and joined the flight onto the lake. Later, the 19 dogs gathered together and sought shelter in a forest. Though unpursued, they were in sorry plight. There was not one who was wounded in 4 or 5 places. Some were wounded grievously. Dub was badly injured in a hind leg. Dolly, the last husky added to the team at Daya, had a badly torn throat. Joe had lost an eye. When Billy, the good-natured, with an ear chewed and rent to ribbons, cried and whimpered through the night. At daybreak they limped wearily back to camp to find the marauders gone and the 2 men in bad temper. Fully half their grub supply was gone. The huskies had chewed through sled lashings and canvas coverings. In fact, nothing, no matter how remotely eatable, had escaped them. They'd eaten a pair of Perot's moose-hide moccasins, chunks out of leather traces, and even 2 feet of lash from the end of Francois's whip. He broke from a mournful contemplation to look over his wounded dogs. "Ah, my friends," he said softly, "maybe it make you mad, those many bites. Maybe all mad dogs. Sacre dame! What do you think, Perot?" The courier shook his head dubiously. With 400 miles of trail between him and Dawson, he could ill afford to have madness break out among his dogs. 2 hours of cursing and exertion got the harness into shape, and the wound, stiff team was under way, struggling painfully over the hardest part of the trail they'd yet encountered, and for that matter, the hardest between them and Dawson. The 30-mile river was wide open. Its wild water defied the frost, and it was eddies only in the quiet places that the ice held it all. 6 days of exhausting toil were required to cover those 30 terrible miles. Terrible they were, for every foot of them was accomplished at the risk of life to dog and man. A dozen times Perot nosed the way broke through the ice bridges, being saved by a long pole he carried, which he held so that if he fell across the hole, it made his body. But a cold snap was on, and the thermometer registered 50 below zero, and each time he broke through, he was compelled, for very life, to build a fire and dry his garments. Nothing daunted him. It was nothing daunted him that he'd been chosen for government courier. He took all manner of risks, resolutely thrusting his little weazened face into the frost and struggling over dim dawn to dark. He skirted the frowning shores on rim ice that bent and crackled under the foot, upon which they dared not halt. Once the sled broke through with Dave and Buck, and they were half frozen and all but drowned by the time they were dragged out. Usual fire was necessary to save them. They were coated solidly with ice, and the 2 men kept them around the fire, sweating and thawing so close they were singed by flames. At another time, Spence went dragging the whole team after him to Buck, who strained backward with all his strength, his forepaws on the slippery edge and the ice quivering and snapping all around. Behind him was Dave, likewise straining backward, and behind the sled was Francois, pulling till his tendons cracked. Again the rim ice broke away, and before and behind, and there was no escape except by the cliff. Perot scaled it by a miracle, while Francois prayed for just that miracle. With every thong and sled lashing and the last bit of harness rove into a long rope, the dogs were hoisted one by one to the clutched cliff. Francois came up last after the sled and Logue. Then came the search for a place to descend, which descent was ultimately made by the aid of a rope, and night found them back on the river with a quarter mile to the day's credit. By the time they made Lulaquina and good ice, Buck was played out. The rest of the dogs were in like condition, but Perot, to make up lost time, pushed them late and early. First day they covered 35 miles to Big Salmon, the next 35 more to Little Salmon, the third day 40 miles, which brought them well up toward Five Fingers. Buck's feet were not so compact and hard as the feet of the huskies. He had softened during the many generations since the day his last wild ancestor was tamed by a cave dweller or riverman. All day long he limped in agony, and once camp was made, lay down like a dead dog. Hungry as he was, he couldn't move to receive his ration of fish, which Francois had to bring to him. Also, the dog driver rubbed Buck's feet for half an hour each night after supper, and sacrificed the tops of his own moccasins to make more moccasins for Buck. This was a great relief, and Buck caused even the weazened face of Perot to twist itself in a grin one morning, when Francois forgot the moccasins, and Buck lay on his back, 4 feet waving appealingly in the air, refusing to budge without them. Later, his feet grew hard to the trail, and the worn out footgear was thrown away.